Imagine a beehive of massive, dry stone ashlar masonry, standing 22 feet high in the Scottish mist near Falkirk. For 1,200 years, it was the most important Roman ruin in Britain, a temple the locals called Arthur's Oan. By the 1100s, chroniclers weren't looking for Arthur in Cornwall, they were looking right here in the land of the Picts.
And yet, if you go to that spot today, you'll find nothing but a housing estate and the ghost of a mill dam. In 1743, the physical evidence of the Northern Arthur was ground into literal gravel for the sake of industrial progress. Today, we're performing an autopsy on that lost monument and proving why this oven was actually the original round table.
Welcome back to the Hidden Round Table.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, and to you listening right now, it is so good to have you with us again for another deep dive.
Absolutely.
If you've been following along with our previous investigations, you know exactly what our mission is here.
Right, we've been very busy.
We've been actively stripping away all that shining plate armor, the pristine castles, the magical French romance.
All the stuff that got layered over the legend over the centuries.
Exactly. We've traded all that in to find the real historical 6th century Dux Bellorum.
The Warlord.
Yeah, the warlord fighting in the mud and the blood of the Old North, the region they called Hen Ogledd.
And we've spent a lot of time on the human element so far, establishing the gritty geopolitical reality of sub-Roman Britain.
Which was, it was grim.
Very grim.
Oh.
We took characters who had been totally warped by later romances.
Yeah.
Like Sir Kay, for instance.
Oh man, Sir Kay. They turned him into this bumbling, boorish French caricature.
Just for comedic relief. But we repositioned him where the actual historical evidence places him.
Right.
We identified him as Caius, a premier sub-Roman cavalry commander of the Votadini tribe.
Holding the line.
Exactly. Holding the line against invaders in a world where the Roman safety net had just completely vanished.
And it's really worth reminding everyone what that world looked like, you know? The Votadini, they weren't knights in shining armor holding jousting tournaments.
No, not at all.
They were a buffer state. They lived right on the bleeding edge of what used to be the Roman Empire.
North of Hadrian's Wall.
North of Hadrian's Wall, interacting constantly with whatever was left of the Roman military apparatus.
And when Rome pulled out in the early 400s, it created this massive power vacuum.
Just totally abandoned them.
Yeah. So these sub-Roman Britons were left to fend off the Picts from the north, and then you have the Saxons coming across the sea.
Right, so we've been entirely focused on the personnel of this era up until now.
The desperate people fighting a desperate defensive war.
But, and this is the pivot, history isn't just made of people?
No, it is tethered to geography. It's anchored in stone.
Anchored in stone. I like that.
To fully understand how a 6th century warlord managed to project enough authority to hold a collapsing society together, we have to look at the physical territory he defended.
Right.
More specifically, we have to look at the structures he utilized to enforce his rule.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are making a major pivot today in this deep dive.
We are
transitioning from the personnel of the legend to what we might call the ultimate architectural receipt.
The smoking gun in the landscape.
Yeah. Today, our focus is entirely on decoding a lost Roman rotunda that sat on the north bank of the River Carron in Stirlingshire.
And this isn't just a quirky old building we're talking about.
No. This structure, which was known for centuries as Arthur's Oan, meaning Arthur's oven,
right.
This served as the physical and political heart of the Northern Arthurian legend.
It is the absolute anchor point for the Northern Theory. It provides a real, tangible, geographic reality to a story that, honestly, has otherwise completely evaporated into myth.
Yeah, it grounds it.
But to understand the building, we actually have to start with the paperwork.
Always the paperwork.
Always. Before we examine the stones themselves, we need to look at the medieval documents that first flagged this geographic anomaly.
Right, because if you're a local living in Scotland in, say, the year 800 or 900, you are staring at a massive stone structure.
A very obvious Roman structure.
Clearly built by the Roman Empire, right? Hundreds of years before Arthur was even a concept.
Yeah.
So how on earth does a 1st or 2nd century Imperial Roman structure get permanently branded with the name of a 6th century Briton warlord?
That connection is recorded in a truly fascinating piece of forensic evidence. And it comes from northern France, dating to the year 1120 AD.
1120 AD. Okay.
There was this man named Lambert de Saint-Omer.
Okay, who was he?
He was a canon at a Benedictine monastery.
Yeah.
And he compiled this monumental, incredibly ambitious encyclopedia called the Liber Floridus.
Which translates to the Book of Flowers.
Exactly, the Book of Flowers.
I want to linger on Lambert for a second because, well, context is everything.
Oh, absolutely.
The year 1120 is right in the thick of what historians call the 12th century Renaissance.
Right, what people often confuse with the later Italian Renaissance.
Yeah, this isn't Da Vinci and Michelangelo. This is an earlier, arguably more fundamental intellectual awakening in Europe.
Monasteries were suddenly just obsessed with synthesizing all human knowledge.
The intellectual climate of Lambert's world was shifting dramatically, wasn't it?
It really was. For centuries, post-Roman Europe was largely focused on just immediate survival.
And localized theology, probably.
Yeah. But by the early 1100s, there was this intense, renewed curiosity about the physical remnants of the past.
About geography, natural history, astronomy.
Exactly. So Lambert essentially locked himself away and synthesized the knowledge of some 200 distinct authorities.
Wow. 200.
He pulled from Bede, from Isidore of Seville, from the Historia Brittamum. He was trying to weave the entirety of known history and geography into this heavenly meadow of literature.
And buried within this massive hand-copied compendium of medieval knowledge is our smoking gun.
Right there in the text.
It's a quote that completely shatters the idea of King Arthur sitting in a sparkling castle in Cornwall pulling a sword from a stone.
Completely shatters it.
But hold on. I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Lambert is sitting in a monastery in northern France in 1120. Why on earth should we trust his geographic positioning of a British warlord from 600 years prior?
That's a fair question.
I mean, how does a French monk know what's going on in the damp, freezing landscape of northern Scotland?
That is the essential question for any historian looking at medieval manuscripts, really.
Right.
We trust Lambert not because he went there himself, but because of the nature of monastic networks.
Textual transmission.
Exactly. The Liber Floridus isn't a work of original fiction. It's a massive aggregation of older texts, traveler accounts, and established geographical records.
Stuff that was already circulating through the church network.
Right. Monasteries were essentially the internet servers of the 12th century.
I love that analogy.
Lambert was compiling raw data that had filtered down from Britain and Ireland through the scriptoriums.
So he's working off older source material that, we might not even have anymore.
Exactly. He's a compiler. He's preserving older realities.
Got it.
And the text he preserves in the Liber Floridus regarding this specific structure is the definitive proof of the Northern theory.
Okay, let's hear it.
Lambert writes, and this is the direct Latin text meticulously preserved, he says, "Es Palatium in Britannia, in Terra Pictorum, Arturi Militis."
Arturi Militis.
Right. He goes on to describe the building being constructed with wondrous art and containing carvings of Arthur's 12 battles.
But that opening phrase is the true treasure.
It really is.
Let me translate that for you listening so you can really feel the weight of what Lambert is saying here.
Go for it.
There is a palace in Britain, in the land of the Picts, of the soldier Arthur.
Just incredible.
I want you to just stop and think about that geography. In Terra Pictorum,
the land of the Picts.
The land of the Picts is definitively, indisputably, ancient Scotland.
Yes. Entirely north of the Antonine Wall.
And the Antonine Wall, just for context, was the absolute northernmost physical border of the Roman Empire.
Right. It stretched across the central belt of Scotland, well above Hadrian's Wall.
It was this massive turf and timber fortification.
So to be in Terra Pictorum means to be out in the true frontier, way beyond the lasting grip of Roman civilization.
And this 12th century encyclopedia explicitly anchors the physical core of the Arthurian legend, his palace in northern Britain.
It completely undermines those southwestern Cornish romantic myths that most of us grew up with.
Oh, absolutely. You don't get much further away from a sunny, chivalric tournament in Camelot than a harsh, windswept stone rotunda in the land of the Picts.
You really don't. The geography is crucial, but what is equally fascinating is the specific terminology Lambert uses to describe the man himself.
Right, I noticed that.
He doesn't call him Arturi Regis, which would translate to King Arthur.
He calls him Arturi Militis.
Exactly.
And I find that incredibly jarring to a modern ear.
Oh, totally.
Why Militis? Why soldier and not king? It feels like a massive demotion.
It does sound like one, doesn't it?
It's like finding a modern, highly classified military dossier that refers to a famous general not as a supreme allied commander, but just as a warlord.
or a guerrilla leader.
Exactly. It completely changes the whole vibe of who this guy was.
It strips away the myth.
It downgrades the pomp and circumstance, but I feel like it upgrades the grit. It makes him sound infinitely more dangerous.
That intuition points directly to the underlying linguistic reality of the time.
Okay, tell me more.
The choice of miles, which in classical Latin means soldier, but in high medieval historiography often leans toward warlord or professional fighter. It's a critical distinction.
So it's not just a grunt.
No. Modern philological analysis suggests that when Lambert, or sources he was copying, used the word miles, it was actually a Latinization of a much older Celtic concept.
A translation.
Right. It was likely a translation of a Gaelic term like fenid, or a Brittonic word denoting a champion or warband leader.
A fenid, that's a concept deeply tied to the land, right?
Exactly.
Like a band of warriors living outside normal society.
It implies a mobile, highly lethal fighting force that operates beyond the bounds of a settled agricultural society.
These were the men you called when the walls were breached.
Right. So when Lambert calls him Arturi Militis, he is preserving the memory of a pragmatic, boots-on-the-ground military figure operating on a brutal northern frontier.
He is not describing a monarch who sits on a throne, wears a jeweled crown, and, hands out quests to passing knights.
Not at all.
He's describing the guy holding the line in the mud.
And this perfectly aligns with the topographic legends of the Old North that we've seen before.
Where Arthur is associated with ruined forts, natural landmarks, and sheer survival.
Yes. Which brings us back to a concept we touch on a lot in these deep dives.
The toponymic palimpsest and weaponized folklore?
Exactly.
Let's break that down for anyone new to the terms. We talk about how a landscape's name is like a palimpsest.
Right.
A palimpsest is an old parchment manuscript where the original writing has been scraped off with a knife and new text has been written over it.
But if you look closely, you can still see the faint original ink underneath.
Exactly. So in this architectural case, the original ink on the landscape is a Roman imperial temple.
Right. It was built to serve the psychological and religious needs of the Roman legions.
But as the empire collapsed and centuries passed, the medieval overwrite occurred.
The local population literally scraped off the Roman identity and wrote Arthur's palace over it.
And the weaponized folklore aspect is how this gritty northern survivalist identity was eventually stolen.
By the Welsh, and later the French Romance writers.
Yeah, they realized they needed a grand, unifying national hero to push their own political PR.
So they looked north, saw this incredibly potent legend anchored to real geography, and they just picked it up.
Completely whitewashed it.
Dressed it in contemporary 12th century chivalric armor, and moved it south to places like Cornwall and Camelot.
Because they needed a myth that fit their refined aristocratic courts, not a grim warlord huddled in a Roman ruin.
Exactly. But Lambert's text in the Liber Floridus predates that massive, coordinated romantic rewrite.
It is a raw, unedited receipt.
It is. And we know just how seriously this geography was taken by medieval scholars because of the physical manuscript tradition itself.
What do you mean by the physical tradition? You mean the way the book was actually constructed?
Yes. If you look at Lambert's original autograph manuscript, which is preserved today as Ghent MS-92,
Okay.
or even the slightly later Wolfenbüttel copy, they utilized a very specific and beautiful tinted drawing technique.
Tinted drawing.
Right. They use black and colored inks to create vibrant, detailed line drawings meant to elucidate these complex geographical and historical concepts.
So they weren't just writing words.
No, they were trying to visually map the world and its history. In their 12th century minds, this geographic reality Arthur reigning from a stone palace in the land of the Picts was a solid, unquestionable historical fact.
Worthy of illustration.
Exactly.
But let's look at the other claim Lambert makes in that quote. He writes that this palace had carvings showing the deeds of Arthur's 12 battles against the Saxons.
Right. The 12 battles.
Now, I have to pause here. Are we really supposed to believe that Arthur, in the middle of a desperate, apocalyptic war for survival against invading Germanic tribes, commissioned a master sculptor?
Right. Like he just hired someone?
Yeah, to chisel his military resume into the side of a building.
Obviously not. That is where we have to look at the psychological mechanism of how local populations interact with ruins.
Okay, tell me how that works.
By the 1100s, local inhabitants, mostly farmers and herders, were staring up at a 1,000-year-old Roman structure.
Right.
And it had these heavily weathered Roman sculptures carved into its stonework. We know from comparable Roman monuments that these carvings most likely depicted imperial Roman eagles.
Legionary standards, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and perhaps the winged goddess Victory holding a laurel wreath.
Right. Standard Roman imperial propaganda. We conquered you. Here's an eagle to prove it.
Exactly. But to the medieval locals living around Falkirk centuries later, the Roman Empire was a distant, incomprehensible myth.
They had no context for a Roman triumph.
What they did have was the burning, localized cultural memory of a hero who had fought a massive war in their own backyard.
So when they looked at those weathered stones, their brains performed an active cultural translation.
Yes. They saw a weathered figure holding something up, and instead of saying, "Ah, the Roman goddess of victory," they said,
Yep, that's Arthur winning at the Battle of the Caledonian Forest.
exactly. It's an incredible phenomenon. They mapped their own local hero onto the alien architecture.
They reinterpreted those weathered Roman carvings as a visual record of what we've previously called the meat grinder.
Arthur's brutal 5th and 6th century campaigns to hold back the Germanic tide.
They needed the building to belong to their story.
Because the human mind abhors a vacuum of meaning. If a grand structure exists in your landscape, it must belong to your greatest hero.
It just makes sense to them. So if the medieval chroniclers thought the carvings depicted Arthur's battles, what were they actually looking at?
Let's reconstruct the crime scene.
Let's do a forensic architectural autopsy of Arthur's Owan.
I love that. Let's do it.
If this building doesn't exist anymore, how do we know what it looks like?
We have to rely on the antiquarians who documented it in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Before the era of modern archaeology.
Right. But thankfully, the measurements they left us are incredibly precise. They were treating this building with absolute reverence.
So give us the dimensions.
First, we have to establish the scale. This was not a small, crude Iron Age hut. Arthur's Owan was a monumental circular rotunda.
Okay.
It had an external diameter of 28 feet.
28 feet wide.
It stood an impressive 22 feet high.
Wow.
And the walls themselves were a massive 4 feet thick at the base.
I want you listening to really picture that in your mind's eye. You're walking along the muddy banks of the River Carron.
The landscape is mostly rolling green hills, maybe some scrubby forest.
And small wooden or wattle-in daub farmhouses. And suddenly, rising out of the Scottish mist, is this 22-foot-tall, perfect stone beehive.
The contrast must have been staggering.
And the engineering was even more impressive than the scale, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was built using ashlar masonry.
Explain ashlar for us.
Ashlar masonry is a crucial detail. It means the stone isn't just gathered from a field. It consists of finely dressed, perfectly squared, and cut blocks of freestone.
The sheer amount of skilled labor required to quarry, transport, and perfectly shape that much stone is immense.
It's imperial-level labor.
And here's the absolute kicker regarding that stonework. It was mortarless.
Mortarless, yes.
They didn't use a single drop of cement or lime to glue those blocks together.
The stones were cut with such mathematical perfection that their own weight, friction, and geometry locked them together.
They held the building up against the harsh Scottish weather for a millennium and a half without any glue. That is just wild.
The roof was equally sophisticated. It featured a corbelled dome.
How does that work?
It means that as the walls rose, each successive ring of stone blocks was stepped slightly inward, progressively narrowing the circle until they met near the top.
But they didn't close the dome completely, right?
No, they didn't. At the very center of the roof was an oculus.
Right. An oculus is a circular opening about 6 to 7 feet in diameter, completely open to the sky.
It's the exact same architectural feature you see in the Pantheon in Rome,
where the light streams down directly into the center of the building.
And the early antiquarians who visited the Owan immediately recognized that parallel. They called it a miniature Pantheon.
And the physical evidence of its Roman origins was literally carved into the stones themselves.
Yes. Beyond just the stylistic similarities, the blocks featured what are known as Lewis holes.
Let me explain Lewis holes because it's a brilliant piece of ancient engineering.
Please do.
If you are a Roman engineer and you need to lift a perfectly smooth, multi-ton block of freestone 20 feet into the air, you can't just wrap ropes around it.
Right, the ropes will get crushed.
Or they'll slip when you try to place the block perfectly flush against the one next to it.
So what do?
You carve a specialized wedge-shaped slot directly into the top center of the stone. Then a Roman crane operator drops a multi-part metal tool called a Lewis into that slot.
And when the crane pulls upward, the metal pieces wedge tight against the sides of the hole.
Exactly. gripping the stone from the inside. You lift it, place it perfectly, and then easily remove the metal tool.
It's ingenious.
Finding Lewis holes is absolute undeniable proof of official Imperial Roman legionary labor.
This was state-sponsored engineering, not local civilian work.
So stepping inside the structure was reportedly just as awe-inspiring as viewing it from the outside.
You would enter through a 9-foot-high arched doorway that faced due east.
Greeting the morning sun.
Right. You would find yourself standing on a meticulously constructed stone-paved floor.
And encircling the inner walls were 2 distinct string courses.
A string course is basically a horizontal band of projecting stone that runs all the way around the interior wall.
Sir Robert Sibbald, an incredible antiquarian who actually went inside the Ogham in 1707, described these interior features beautifully.
What did he say?
He said the projecting stones were flat underneath and sloped on top, like the forepart of a desk.
Wow, so it gave the interior an incredibly structured, formal feel.
And right in the center of the floor, sitting directly beneath the open oculus,
Bathed in whatever light came through that roof.
stood a massive stone pedestal.
So we have this incredible, highly sophisticated Roman structure sitting right on the absolute edge of the frontier.
Which ties directly into the northern map we've been building over the last few deep dives.
Remember, the Ogham was located just a stone's throw from Camelot.
Camelot was the massive, sprawling Roman fort near Falkirk that served as a major interface between the Roman military and the northern tribes.
And we established previously the very direct linguistic and geographic link between Camelot, the Roman hub, and the later Romantic name Camelot.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The proximity to Camelot is vital.
It establishes the region as a heavily militarized, highly significant zone of Roman occupation.
But here's the question that really drives this whole investigation.
Okay.
Why did Arthur, a 6th century Briton warlord desperately fighting off invaders, care about an abandoned Roman rotunda?
It's a great question.
He didn't build it. His people didn't use it for its original purpose, so why did it become the palace of the legend?
To understand Arthur's motive, we have to explore the concept of psychological scaffolding.
Psychological scaffolding, I love that.
You have to visualize the brutal reality of a post-Roman leader. The year is roughly 500 AD.
Right?
Arthur is operating in the dirt, the mud, and the sheer chaos of the Old North. The Roman legions have abandoned the island. The complex imperial economy has collapsed entirely.
The surrounding medieval population, his potential followers, and his enemies are living in timber and earth structures.
Structures that will rot away and collapse in a single generation.
Right. The landscape is reverting to nature. It's bleak.
And yet, amidst this societal decay, there stands this anomalous, incredibly sophisticated dry stone dome reaching 22 feet into the sky.
Seemingly immune to time and weather.
Exactly.
Let's use an analogy here to really nail down psychological scaffolding.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a modern tech startup that is fundamentally broke.
Just scrapping by.
Right. They don't have the capital to build a massive headquarters, but they managed to sign a lease and move into an old, majestic 19th century bank building downtown.
Complete with massive marble pillars, vaulted ceilings, mahogany walls.
Exactly. By simply operating out of that building, the startup instantly absorbs the historical trust, the authority, and the permanence projected by the architecture.
When investors walk in, they don't see a scrappy, desperate team. They see the marble.
Yes, Arthur was doing the exact same thing.
That is an excellent way to frame it. A warlord attempting to unite disparate, warring British tribes and project unquestionable authority across a fractured landscape desperately needs a powerful symbol.
He doesn't have the supply chains, the quarries, or the master engineers to build a pantheon from scratch.
So he occupies the one the Romans left behind.
By making the Ogham his literal headquarters, his gathering place, or his palace, Arthur was using the physical structure as a psychological scaffold.
He was deliberately wrapping his new, fragile regime in the ghost of Rome's ancient legitimacy.
He was communicating to his followers and his enemies alike. I am the inheritor of the empire. I command the stone.
It is the ultimate geopolitical power move.
He just walks in and says, yeah, this is mine now. The empire is dead. Long live the Dux Bellorum.
Exactly.
But that makes me wonder, what was the original Roman function of this building before Arthur claimed it?
We have a lot of clues for that.
It's round, it's open at the top, it has a massive pedestal in the middle. It certainly wasn't a standard military bathhouse.
Or a grain storage facility. No.
Yeah.
All the archaeological and architectural evidence points toward it originally being a tropium.
a tropium, a victory monument.
Right. These were highly symbolic structures built by the Roman legions to mark significant military triumphs.
And in this specific location, it served an even grander purpose, didn't it?
It marked the literal, physical edge of the known world.
Wow.
It was a triumphant, permanent statement in stone at the furthest northern reach of the Roman Empire, designed to intimidate the northern tribes.
And celebrate the reach of the emperor. And the artifacts found at the site absolutely back this up. We're not talking about domestic pottery here.
No, we're talking about fragments of lava corn stones that were imported all the way from Andernach on the Rhine in Germany.
Think about the logistics of that. Hauling heavy volcanic stone across Europe and across the sea just to grind grain at the specific monument.
It was a huge flex. They also found the horns of great cows inside the rotunda, which strongly suggests that ritual animal sacrifices took place there.
To honor the gods of the legions.
Right. But the most evocative artifact ever recovered from the site was found much later.
Oh, the brass finger.
Yes. Around the year 1700 by an antiquarian named Sir William Bruce.
While examining the structure, he found a massive brass finger lodged tightly in a chink in the interior masonry.
That is my absolute favorite detail in this entire story.
A single, massive brass finger, and the contemporary accounts noted that it was polished to the semblance of gold.
Let's piece together what that implies.
We have a huge stone pedestal in the exact center of the room.
We have a massive brass finger polished to look like gold.
It tells us that originally, standing on that central pedestal, directly beneath the beam of sunlight pouring through the oculus,
Was a colossal gleaming bronze cult statue.
Given the function of a tropeum, it was almost certainly a statue of Mars, the god of war, or perhaps a personification of the winged goddess Victory.
Imagine walking through that arched doorway into the dark, echoing dome and looking up to see a 20-foot golden god staring down at you.
Illuminated by a single shaft of light, it would be terrifying.
And awe-inspiring even to a Roman citizen.
To a sub-Roman Britain, centuries later, it would be downright supernatural.
No wonder this specific building became the absolute heart of the Arthurian mythos in the north.
The psychological impact of that architecture didn't just affect medieval Britons either.
No, it resonated down through the centuries.
That physical awe is exactly what drew generations of scholars to it, initiating what we can call the antiquarian pilgrimage.
Long before we had modern scientific archaeology, and crucially, long before the building was destroyed, this rotunda became a mecca for the earliest forensic historians in Britain.
Because these early scholars recognized its profound value.
They did. They recorded the ghost while it still stood.
And reading their accounts is amazing because you can track how the local folklore actively and aggressively overwrote the Roman stone.
Like Hector Boece in 1527.
Right, a very prominent Scottish historian. When he visited the site, he noted that by his time, the locals didn't call it a Roman temple.
They certainly didn't care about Mars or Victory.
They called it Arthur's House, Arthur's house.
And Boece observed something incredibly telling about human nature. He wrote that the inhabitants had physically chiseled away the original Roman eagles and signs.
And they deliberately engraved Arthur's arms in their place.
This is where we see the concept of the toponymic palimpsest made literal, physical.
They weren't just renaming the landscape in their stories.
They were taking iron chisels and scraping away the old imperial ink.
To carve the new localized legend into the very fabric of the building.
It is a violent, deliberate act of historical revisionism by a community desperate to anchor their hero to their home.
I always wonder about the sensory experience of those early scholars. What was it like to actually stand in this thing before it fell?
Just to step off the muddy, rain-soaked bank of the River Carron, duck through that 9-foot archway.
And walk into this ancient echo chamber that had survived everything history threw at it.
We are so fortunate to have highly evocative accounts of exactly that experience.
Like Sir Robert Sibbald, whom we mentioned earlier.
Yes. He was the geographer royal for Scotland, a man of profound intellect and curiosity.
When he visited in 1707, he stepped into the dark interior, escaping the omnipresent Scottish mist.
He wrote about how dark it was inside. He had to view the weathered, defaced eagles and the faded, ghostly figure of the goddess Victory narrowly with a lighted link.
A lighted link meaning a torch. Just picture the cinematography of that moment. You have this brilliant, wig-wearing 18th century scholar, a man of the Enlightenment,
standing alone in a 1,500-year-old Roman dome.
He is holding a flaming torch up to the curved, damp stone walls, trying to trace the faint, battered outlines of an empire that vanished a millennium ago.
Fighting against centuries of folklore, just to see the truth underneath.
It is incredibly poignant.
The dedication of these men was extraordinary, and the visual architectural records they left us are just as vital as their written accounts.
Tell us about John Adair.
Around the year 1700, a mapmaker and geographer named John Adair visited the Owan and made a series of detailed architectural drawings.
Plotted precisely at a 1 to 100 scale.
But Adair's drawings present us with a fascinating historical puzzle.
What's the puzzle?
He depicted the exterior of the Rotunda with a very smooth appearance. It didn't look like rough, weathered blocks. It looked like seamlessly polished ashlar.
Which raises some massive, fascinating questions about ancient construction techniques.
Was the freestone just miraculously preserved against the harsh, freezing and thawing Scottish weather for 15 straight centuries?
That seems physically impossible.
Or, as several modern architectural historians strongly suspect, had the Romans or perhaps even Arthur's Britons centuries later rendered the entire outside of the stone dome in a thick, bright, smooth layer of plaster or lime wash?
Imagine the visual impact of that. A gleaming, brilliant white dome sitting starkly amidst the dark green hills and gray skies of the Old North.
It would have functioned as a shining, unmistakable beacon on the frontier, visible for miles.
A lighthouse of imperial and later royal power.
But the true hero of this preservation effort, at least on paper, was Alexander Gordon.
Right, 1726.
In 1726, he published an incredible foundational book called Itinerarium Septentrinale,
which was essentially a detailed travelogue of northern antiquities.
Gordon was an incredibly sharp, meticulous observer. He noticed something everyone else had missed.
What did he find?
He noted that the Owan wasn't just sitting flat on the ground like a cup on a saucer. He identified a hollow foundation plinth of a much larger circumference that was built directly into the declivity or the downward slope of the rising ground toward the river.
Gordon understood the underlying engineering.
He realized that because the structure was built on a hill sloping down to the river, the builders had to compensate for the grade.
The lower 4 courses of massive stone on the south side were hidden deep within the earth,
acting as a massive subterranean anchor to prevent the entire 22-foot structure from sliding into the mud.
And Gordon's tape measure was spectacularly precise.
Very much so.
Several years later, around the same time, another famous antiquarian named William Stukeley sent an architect named Andrews Jelf to take his own measurements.
And when you compare Gordon's numbers to Jelf's architectonic measurements,
they differ by less than a single foot in any proportion.
These guys, working in the 1720s with rudimentary tools, essentially gave us a perfect, to-scale CAD model of the building.
Which makes what happens next all the more devastating.
Absolutely devastating.
We have perfectly recorded the dimensions of a monument that survived the cataclysmic fall of the Roman Empire.
It survived the brutal meat grinder of the post-Roman Dark Ages, serving as a fortress and a psychological scaffold for Arthur.
It survived over a millennium of the harshest medieval Scottish weather, and it survived centuries of violent, shifting political regimes.
So what finally brought down the northern Camelot?
What force was powerful enough to destroy something that had stood against time itself?
A man who wanted to save 5 shillings.
The story of the destruction of Arthur's Owan is a profound commentary on the shifting values of society.
It is genuinely one of the most infuriating stories in the entire history of archaeology.
We are talking about the Great Vandalism of 1743.
The villain of this story, and let's be clear, he is universally recognized by historians as a villain, is Sir Michael Bruce,
the 6th Baronet of Stenhouse.
The estate of Stenhouse encompassed the land where the Owan sat. And Sir Michael Bruce, an ambitious landowner looking toward the new economy, decided he needed a new mill dam.
Basically a weir on the River Carron to provide water power for his local industrial ventures.
The construction of a mill dam requires a massive amount of highly durable dressed stone to line the water channels and resist the constant force of the river.
Now, Bruce had a choice.
Right.
He could hire men to quarry raw stone, transport it, and dress it.
Or he could look at the 1,500-year-old, perfectly cut Roman ashlar blocks sitting completely unused right there on his estate.
He chose the latter and ordered the complete demolition of Arthur's Owan.
It's almost incomprehensible to a modern mind.
It's like a property developer bulldozing Stonehenge because they need a flat space to build a strip mall parking lot.
Or a city tearing down the Colosseum in Rome because they need some quick gravel for a new highway interchange.
It is the absolute pinnacle of what we can call industrial pragmatism.
Industrial pragmatism is the exact right term. It was a ruthless, pure resource extraction mindset that characterized the worst impulses of the early Industrial Revolution in Britain.
To a capitalist landowner like Sir Michael Bruce, the past held absolutely no inherent value.
A Roman monument was not a sacred connection to history. It was simply a pile of unused building materials.
If it wasn't generating capital, it was in the way.
But the sheer ridiculous pettiness of the act is what makes it a genuine tragedy.
Sir John Clerk, one of the leading antiquarians and intellectuals of the time, was absolutely apoplectic when he heard the news.
He documented the economics of Bruce's decision, and it is maddening.
Clark noted in his writings that Bruce actually owned extensive, easily accessible stone quarries on his own estate.
He could have hired men to extract the exact same quantity of fresh stone for his dam.
The total cost of that labor, a mere 5 shillings.
5 shillings. He obliterated the most important Roman structure in northern Britain to save the equivalent of a modest bar tab.
And it gets so much worse.
It really does.
This wasn't done in secret in the dead of night. When the local community, the educated gentlemen, and the historical societies found out what Bruce was planning to do,
They mobilized to stop him.
local gentlemen literally pooled their money and offered to buy the building from him outright to protect it.
When he refused to sell the land, they made an even more desperate offer.
They offered to personally pay for the labor to quarry, cut, and transport alternative stone to his dam site, completely free of charge, just to save the Rotunda.
They offered him a free dam.
And Bruce still said no.
He proceeded with the demolition, not out of economic necessity, but out of sheer stubbornness.
A misplaced assertion of property rights and a bizarre, arrogant spite for the antiquarians who he likely viewed as sentimental fools.
The backlash from the intellectual community was instantaneous, and it was furious.
The antiquarian community labeled Bruce a Goth and a Vandal.
Now today, calling someone a vandal just means they spray-painted a wall.
But in the 18th century, steeped in classical education, those terms carried immense, devastating weight.
They were invoking the literal barbarian tribes that sacked and burned the glory of Rome.
They were calling him an enemy of civilization itself.
They saw this as a profound, unforgivable betrayal of Scottish national history.
The anger wasn't just confined to angry letters either. It manifested in art and early media.
William Stukeley, the antiquarian who had commissioned those precise measurements we discussed, was so enraged that he sought a very public revenge.
It is my favorite piece of historical revenge ever executed.
Tell us about the print.
Stukeley drew and published a highly circulated satirical print titled Sir Mitchell Bruce Stonekiller.
It's incredible.
It's this incredibly dark, dramatic, almost apocalyptic etching that literally imagines Sir Michael Bruce suffering in eternal damnation for his crime against history.
The print shows Bruce being dragged down to hell,
tormented by grinning demons and driven into a literal lake of fire by an angel wielding a flaming sword.
All the while, a classical Roman deity looks down from the clouds in stern judgment.
It perfectly highlights the ultimate violent clash of the era, the desperate desire to preserve human heritage versus the blind, destructive march of industrial progress.
Stukeley wanted to ensure that Bruce's name would live in infamy forever. And in a way, through deep dives like this, he succeeded.
But the raw physical loss of the monument left a massive void in the landscape that couldn't be filled with satirical cartoons.
The literal fabric of the Northern Arthurian legend, the stones that Arthur himself may have touched, had been ripped out of the landscape.
Which leaves us with the final nagging mystery. What actually happened to the stones after the dam was built?
Right, because for centuries, there was this very convenient, highly romantic, almost mythological story about the aftermath of the vandalism.
The traditional narrative that was passed down said that the gods of history took immediate, violent revenge on Sir Michael Bruce.
The story went that a massive, unprecedented flood tore down the River Carron the very next day,
violently smashing the new mill dam into pieces and washing all the sacred Roman stones out into the Firth of Forth and into the deep sea, where they were lost forever.
It's a very neat moralistic ending. You destroyed the temple for a dam, so the river destroyed your dam.
It is a comforting myth, but as forensic historians, we favor the harsh reality of dirt and stone over the comfort of magic and mystery.
And the forensic truth regarding the stones of Arthur's Owen is much darker and much more mundane.
In the 1980s, an incredibly diligent researcher named Robert Mitchell decided to stop reading the Romantic folklore and started digging into the actual dry industrial records of the area.
He proposed what we now call the Mitchell hypothesis.
And what Mitchell found is that the Great Flood story is entirely a myth.
The mill dam didn't wash away.
In fact, it survived, it held strong, and it thrived.
Just a few years after the demolition of the Oan, the famous Carron Ironworks was established in that exact same spot.
For context, the Carron Ironworks became one of the largest, most powerful ironworks in all of Europe.
They literally manufactured the heavy cannons known as carronades for Admiral Nelson's navy.
And this massive industrial complex utilized Sir Michael Bruce's exact mill system and his dam to provide the immense water power needed for their massive blast furnaces.
The implications of Mitchell's research are profound.
It suggests that the literal fabric of the Oan, the perfectly dressed Roman ashlar blocks, the stones of the Corbelled dome,
The physical embodiment of the Round Table of the Northern Arthur,
was used as the facing for that incredibly successful industrial dam.
and over the ensuing decades, as the Carron Ironworks expanded into a sprawling, smoke-belching behemoth, they altered the course of the river.
Poured thousands of tons of concrete and buried the old dam works entirely.
Which means the stones of Arthur's Oan aren't resting peacefully at the bottom of the sea.
They are still there.
They are buried deep under the concrete foundations, the toxic industrial soil, and the modern housing estates of present-day Stenhousemuir.
Mitchell even claimed during his fieldwork in the 80s that he found a heavily silted, hidden entry point into the old brick mill race, leading right into the dark earth toward where the stones are entombed.
It is a haunting realization to think those Roman stones are sitting in the dark beneath a modern town.
But Mitchell's hypothesis also neatly explains why later, highly funded archaeological attempts to find the original site of the building failed so spectacularly.
Right, because once the building was gone, people eventually forgot exactly where it stood.
Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there were multiple earnest attempts to locate at least the foundation trench of the Oan.
In 1868, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland went out and dug a series of trial trenches. They found absolutely nothing.
In 1950, Kenneth Steer, who was a highly respected, meticulous archaeologist, excavated what was known as the authorized site.
This was the location agreed upon by local traditions and recorded in the 1841 New Statistical Account.
Steer dug deep, and he found absolutely nothing but natural, undisturbed soil deposits.
Steer concluded, quite reasonably based on his evidence, that the site had been entirely leveled and scraped away by industrial activity, leaving no trace.
But this leads us to the decoy theory, which I find absolutely fascinating because it involves deliberate 19th century industrial espionage.
You have to ask, why was Kenneth Steer digging in the wrong place?
The decoy theory suggests that Victorian accounts of the site's location, specifically the writings of the Reverend John Bonar, may have deliberately provided false coordinates to the historical community.
They confidently pointed antiquarians toward a place called the Washing Green.
To understand the motive behind the decoy theory, you have to look at the socioeconomic tension of the 19th century.
You have wealthy, powerful estate owners running massive, highly profitable industrial operations.
And on the other side, you have probing, persistent antiquarians and early archaeologists who want to dig up the land to look for ruins.
Exactly. Why would the estate owners point them to the Washing Green?
To protect the estate from disruption.
The true site of the Oan, based on older maps and topographical logic, was likely much closer to the Stenhouse mansion itself.
But by the 19th century, that area was heavily developed. It was covered with crucial industrial and estate infrastructure.
The absolute last thing the wealthy estate owners wanted was a bunch of zealous archaeologists showing up with legal backing, tearing up their expensive property, and halting their operations just to look for Roman ghosts.
So, according to the theory, they created a very convincing decoy narrative.
They pointed scholars to a benign piece of land roughly 500 meters west of the true location.
It was a wild goose chase designed to protect capital.
The real foundation of the northern Camelot, the actual earth where Arthur made his stand, is likely 500 meters east, quietly and permanently hidden by the relentless progress of the Industrial Revolution.
So let's look at the immense tragedy of this.
It is a tragedy.
The original stones are buried in the dark under a concrete ironworks.
The physical foundation of the building is lost to a Victorian decoy plot fueled by class interests.
How does the memory of this place survive? Because it does survive in a very physical, very tangible way today.
And that is through the stone ghost of Penicuik.
The story of the dovecote at Penicuik is one of the most touching epilogues in British architectural history.
It represents the profound emotional connection people can forge with history.
Remember Sir John Clerk, the antiquarian who raged against Bruce's vandalism?
Yes.
He had a son, Sir James Clerk. Sir James had likely visited the Oan as a young man with his father.
He was so profoundly moved by the loss of the monument and so deeply affected by his father's grief over it that he decided to resurrect it.
In 1767, just a couple of decades after the demolition, Sir James commissioned a dovecote.
Which is a functional building designed to house pigeons or doves.
Right, to be built on the stable block of his sprawling estate at Penicuik House south of Edinburgh.
But he didn't build just any standard wooden dovecote.
He built an exact-to-scale replica of Arthur's Owen.
He didn't rely on memory. He utilized the incredibly meticulous measurements recorded by Alexander Gordon and Andrews Jelf before the destruction.
He insisted that his builders use the exact same mortarless ashlar masonry technique.
He commanded them to build the exact same corbel dome and to leave the exact same size oculus open to the sky at the top.
It is a perfect mathematical clone of the Lost Monument.
And the incredible thing is, if you travel to Penicuik House today, you can walk right inside it.
You can step through the archway, stand under the oculus, look up at the sky, and feel the exact dimensions.
The acoustic echo and the spatial reality of the space where the legendary Northern Arthur once projected his power.
It stands there today as a literal stone ghost, preserving the shape of the past, even though the original material was stolen from us.
It is a profound act of architectural defiance. It allows the spatial reality of the Northern Arthurian tradition to persist against the forces of industrial erasure.
So we always ask this massive question at the end of a deep dive.
We do.
After unearthing Lambert's Liber Floridus from a French monastery, tracing the architectural blueprints of a lost Roman dome, raging at the sheer greed of Sir Michael Bruce, and finding a stone ghost resurrected south of Edinburgh. What does this all mean?
How does this change our understanding of King Arthur?
Exactly.
If we look at the entire arc of Arthur's Owen, we are fundamentally looking at the tragedy of three distinct eras and how each era used the landscape.
First, you have the Roman era.
The structure was constructed as a potent symbol of imperial triumph, a tropium marking the bleeding edge of the known world, projecting a beacon of absolute order into the wilderness.
Second, you have the sub-Roman era, the so-called Dark Ages.
The empire was gone, the supply chains were broken, but the stone remained. It was repurposed.
It became a psychological scaffold for a desperate, boots-on-the-ground warlord named Arthur, a place to project legitimacy and rally a fragile resistance against the advancing Saxons.
It became his palace.
And finally, you have the 18th century, the era of industrial greed.
An era where 1,500 years of history, the physical anchor of Britain's greatest mythology, was deemed fundamentally less valuable than 5 shillings worth of mill-dam gravel.
It is the ultimate proof of our series rule. We favor dirt and stone over magic and mystery because the real story of King Arthur isn't about a wizard casting a spell in a shining castle.
It's about the fragile, muddy, desperate physical reality of survival on the absolute frontier.
It's about a warlord hiding in an abandoned Roman dome just to survive the winter and hold his people together.
And it's about how easily that profound, earth-shattering history can be completely erased, ground into gravel, and forgotten by people who only care about the bottom line.
The true legend isn't the magic of the sword. The true legend is the stubborn survival of the memory, passed down through folklore and text, despite the violent destruction of the physical evidence.
Absolutely.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you, listening right now. We live in a world built quite literally on top of 1,000 other worlds. The next time you are walking through a completely unremarkable modern space, maybe you're cutting across a suburban housing estate, walking through a noisy industrial park, or just standing on a gray concrete sidewalk waiting for a bus stop for a second and look down.
Consider what toponymic palimpsests you might be standing on.
What ancient ink, what sacred spaces have been scraped away so they could pour that asphalt?
Because if the physical heart of the Arthurian legend, a monumental 22-foot Roman dome, could be completely erased and buried under Scottish ironworks for the sake of a minor mill dam.
What other world-shaping monuments and what forgotten heroes are quietly sleeping right beneath your everyday boots?